HSA Prep, because now it counts.
Good afternoon. I'm Mr. Wilson, and I'm here to help you with the LSN portion of the HSA. Hopefully today we will learn a lot of things that will help you do a really good job. Eight specific landmark Supreme Court cases. There are 8 of them that you have to know. Every now and then they will also put on some other important Supreme Court cases on the test. However, whenever they do that, they always give you enough information, either in the background or in a blurb or in an excerpt, to have you understand the case. With these specific 8 landmark cases, however, the writers of the HSA just expect you to know them. You need to know them inside and out. The first case that we're going to look at is Marbury v. Madison. Marbury v. Madison was one of the very first cases ever handled by the Supreme Court of the United States. In this case, judicial review was established. Judicial review is often considered another key feature of our government. Judicial review means that the Supreme Court can review laws or actions by the President and decide if they are legal, decide if they are in keeping with the Constitution. The Supreme Court, remember, is the judicial branch essentially. The justices have the power to interpret what the Constitution means, and they use that power to also interpret what laws mean. If they decide that a law doesn't agree with the Constitution, they can actually throw out that law. Or they can send it back to Congress and say, Congress, you need to rewrite this, or President, you need to enforce this law differently. They can also say that things that the President does aren't in keeping with the Constitution. This first case was the first time that the Supreme Court had ever tried to use that judicial review principle. Because they successfully used it, Marbury v. Madison is the Supreme Court case that is remembered as establishing the use and the success of judicial review in our country. Another early Supreme Court case is McCulloch v. Maryland. That early Supreme Court case established the supremacy of the federal government over the states. You may remember that I have already mentioned federalism. That means we have different levels of government. We have the state level, and above that, we have the national level represented in Washington, D.C. Whenever there is a question about which group should be in charge, it's important for you to remember that the question can be settled by the Supreme Court, but also it can be settled simply by remembering that in McCulloch v. Maryland, the federal government always wins out. If there's a question between a state law and a federal law, the federal law will take precedence. It will be more important. If there's a question between the Constitution of Maryland and the Constitution of the whole United States, the Constitution of the United States takes precedence. That was established by McCulloch v. Maryland. You may also have heard it called the Supremacy Clause. That's another part of the Constitution that establishes that the Constitution of the United States, is the most important document. Another earlier Supreme Court case was one called Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson is a very unfortunate Supreme Court case, but because it's so important, we still have to learn about it. It established something called the separate but equal doctrine. You may have heard of that when you've learned in other classes, perhaps your history class or a literature class, about segregation or about discrimination. Plessy v. Ferguson was the Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court decided that separating people on a basis of being white versus black would be okay. Plessy v. Ferguson is what made it possible, for example, for separate facilities, separate bathrooms, separate entrances, separate restaurants, separate water fountains, separate cars, separate bus parts. All of those seating arrangements, that's because of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is now recognized as a terrible, terrible decision. However, at the time it was very important because it legitimized all of the segregation that was going on in the southern states. And it made it possible for that to spread out of not just the southern states, but into other states as well. And for a very long time in the United States, Plessy versus Ferguson was used for separate education, was used to keep African Americans out of certain neighborhoods. So there's a long history with this case. Luckily, about 70 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, another Supreme Court case totally reversed the situation. That case is Brown versus Board of Education. In that case, the separate but equal doctrine that had been established with Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned. No longer would there be a separate area on a bus or on a train for African Americans. No longer would there be separate entrances. No longer would there be hotels that only catered to white patrons or to African American patrons. And no longer would there be segregated education. Brown versus Board of Education is the landmark case that decided that we are going to have an integrated educational system in the United States. It took a long time for it to actually go into effect, but Brown versus Board of Education is what set all that in motion. It swept away literally over a century's worth of discrimination and racism just in one Supreme Court case. There are 4 others that you have to know. The Supreme Court case known as Miranda versus Arizona is a more recent one. It established the right of the accused to not incriminate themselves when they are being questioned by the police. You may have heard of this before on some of the police dramas on TV. The police are told to Mirandize a suspect. That comes from Miranda versus Arizona. In that case, the people who are accused of a crime are told by the police that they have the right to remain silent, that anything they say can and will be used against them in the court of law, and that they have a right to an attorney. All of those rights are in the Constitution, but because of Miranda versus Arizona, that case established that suspects have to be informed of their rights. If the suspect says, I want to remain silent, the interview or the interrogation by the police has to stop, and a lawyer has to be obtained. Another one of these cases that has to do with the right of the accused is Gideon versus Wainwright. In that case, the right of the accused is to an attorney, and the attorney can be provided by the government at no cost to the accused if that accused person is too poor to afford it. One of the main rights in the Bill of Rights is that everybody who's accused of a crime has the right to have an attorney represent them in court. Gideon versus Wainwright established that if you are too poor to afford your own attorney, the police cannot keep you from getting an attorney. They cannot talk you out of getting an attorney. You have that absolute right to an attorney, and if you can't afford that attorney, you get a public defender. That person will represent you for little or no cost. Another important Supreme Court case that involves freedom of expression, or the First Amendment, is Tinker versus Des Moines. In that case, students were holding a very silent but meaningful tribute to people who had been killed in the Vietnam War in school. The school district did not approve of the demonstration, and so the students got into trouble. This case went to the Supreme Court, and it was established that students have freedom of expression when they're in school, so long as it doesn't disrupt the learning process. This case has been used widely because It represents the idea that students have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion in the school day. Another one that had to do with freedoms of students is a case from 1985. It's New Jersey versus TLO. In this case, however, it went against student rights. It limits the privacy of students in school and allows administrators to open students' lockers. In this case, students are now shown that they do not have the full rights of adults when they are in school. Students do have a right to privacy. However, the safety of the school is paramount and is more important than the individual student's privacy rights. So if an administrator thinks that a student has something illegal or something dangerous in their locker, the administrator is authorized to open up that student's locker. This case also is very important because oftentimes students wonder, why do administrators have so much authority over them? Why do teachers get to tell them what to do? Part of the reason is that it was reinforced by New Jersey versus TLO. That's one of the reasons why students sometimes don't like student rules. But because of the safety of the school, we can bring in dogs to sniff for drugs. Students can have their purses or their backpacks checked. Students have to be careful what's in their cars in the parking lot. If there's drug paraphernalia in the car, that, since it is on school grounds, can also be searched. All of these things are meant to keep the students safe, but oftentimes they are rather unpopular with the students. New Jersey versus TLO is one of those cases where the rights of the authority at the school was reinforced over student rights. Another good question, or another good area to look at, are the major types of governments. There are essentially three major kinds of government in the world. These three are the ones that will appear on the HSA: autocracy, oligarchy, and democracy. An autocracy is a government where it is ruled by one person. Some other names for an autocracy are absolute monarchies or dictatorships. In an autocracy, that one person or that one small group runs the whole government. A good example of that is North Korea. You may have heard of North Korea in the news. In North Korea, one person is the dictator, and he tells all of the people what to do. He runs not only the major aspects of the government, but also the economy. He also runs a lot of things like the education system. The dictator is in charge of everything. That's what makes it an autocracy. It's one person in charge of everything. The next kind, however, isn't quite as bad, and oftentimes can actually be rather fair depending on how it's done. It's called an oligarchy. It's ruled by a few people, and this is relatively a few people. Other kinds of governments that have this sometimes are called juntas, or sometimes are given the name people's republics. A good example of an oligarchy is China. In China, the voters don't really get to say much about how the government will be run. Rather, a very small party, the Communist Party, runs the government. Now, granted, China is close to 2 billion people, and there are millions upon millions of people who are in the Communist Party. But relative to the giant size of China as a whole, it's a government by a few people. Just that small group gets to vote, they get to choose the leaders that they get to vote for, and they get to run most of the things in the economy and in the government all by themselves. If you're not a part of that small group in China, you really don't have any power or any authority in the government. So that kind of government can be very restrictive unless there's a good constitution to keep the government under control. Another kind of government, and the government that you probably are most familiar with, is democracy. Democracy is one of the aspects of our government. It means rule by many people. It can be ruled by everybody, or it can mean that a large group of voters elects representatives. So other kinds of governments that have a democracy are constitutional monarchies and representative democracies. Representative democracy is technically the kind of government the United States has. Some countries that are democracies like us, there's the Netherlands, that's in Europe. The UK, also known as Great Britain, we've already looked at them. Germany has a democracy. Of course, the United States, Canada, Japan, Mexico. There's lots of governments that have a democracy. They run them differently. Some of them, as I've already mentioned, are presidential. Some of them are parliamentary democracies. But because they have the rule by the people get to do most of the decision-making either through voting or by voting for representatives who vote for them in Congress. The people get to say what they want to see happen in their government, and the government follows through with that. That's what makes it a democracy. Knowing the three kinds of governments can answer a lot of different kind of questions on the HSA. On the HSA, they might ask you for a description of what the autocracy would be or what an oligarchy would be, or they will give you a situation and ask you, is this happening in an autocracy or is this happening in a democracy or an oligarchy? So it can go both ways on the HSA test. There are also 3 ways that you can set up whatever type of government you have. You can set your government up as a unitary system, as a federal system, or as a confederated system. A unitary system means that the central government holds all the authority and power. That means there is no federalism. There are no states, there are no provinces, there are no departments, there are no prefectures. It means that the government in the capital city is the only real government throughout the whole country. Yes, there will be cities, but the city government will only have very, very limited authority. The majority of the power and authority to govern people's lives and the lawmaking happens at the one central government. Some examples of a unitary system are, again, the UK, also known as Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. Those countries have a unitary system. As it happens, they're all unitary democracies. That means they have a democracy where the people vote, but they only get to vote in just national elections. There are no state elections. There are no county elections. Another way to set up your government is as a federal system. Federal means that the government and the governmental power and authority are shared. They're shared between the central government and states. That's what we have. The United States has a federal system. Canada has a federal system. Germany and India also have federal systems. As we've already looked at, though, you also know that all of these countries are also democracies. That means that they are federal democracies. The United States is a federal democracy. We have 50 states, each with their own government, plus we have one government that watches over all of 50 states at the same time. That's the government in Washington, D.C. A third way, and it's a very uncommon way to set up your government, is by having it be confederated. That means that the individual states hold nearly all the governmental power and authority. So rather than having a central government watching over the individual states, really the states just sort of hang together and watch over themselves. There really are no longer any real confederacies anymore in the world. In the past, there have been. If you remember your U.S. history, you'll remember the Confederation. That was the southern states that broke away from the rest of the Union during the Civil War. They formed their own government and called it a confederacy. Those 11 renegade states that were rebelling, they became a confederacy. They really didn't have any sort of central government. They had what they called a national government in Richmond, Virginia, but that was only to fight the war. Apparently, after the war was to have ended, they were going to simply be 11 independent states. Another country that used to be a confederacy but really isn't anymore is Switzerland. Switzerland is a mountainous country in the center of Europe. And they used to be a confederacy. It means that they were small individual parts of one country that basically ruled themselves. They didn't really have an overall authority. However, over the years, Switzerland has had to modernize, and modernization has taken them from a confederacy to a more federal system. Again, there really are no confederacies anywhere in the world anymore, but sometimes on the HSA you'll still see the term as a question. So knowing what a confederacy is helps. Make sure you know how they are the same and different, these three systems of setting up government. You can have a unitary democracy, you can have a unitary dictatorship, you can have a unitary oligarchy, you can have a federal oligarchy. You could probably, it would be difficult, have a federal dictatorship. You can have a confederated oligarchy. So these systems work with the types of governments so that you can have in sort of a mix and match situation. One of the things that's really hard for students to understand is how the government manages the economy. So we're going to look again at economics. There are two systems in the United States for managing the economy. They work simultaneously and they work cooperatively, but they are different. Our government manages the economy through fiscal policy and through monetary policy. Fiscal policy is taxes and spending and the federal budget. So fiscal policy is whenever you hear about the government raising or lowering taxes, or the government changing how much it's going to spend on certain programs, or how much money the government has brought in the budget and how much things are going to cost for the upcoming year. In our government, the executive branch, headed by the president, prepares the budget. Each year the president and his staff prepares a federal budget. The legislative branch, on the other hand, authorizes it and allocates the funds. That means that Congress decides if it's going to pay attention to the federal budget and how it's going to do what the president wants, and then it has to actually pass laws to get those funds out to the various programs. Because of our separation of powers, we have two different branches working on fiscal policy. You could also note that that means that it's also a matter of checks and balances. The president can prepare the budget, but that doesn't mean that it's automatically going to go into effect. The legislative branch can allocate whatever it wants to, but unless the president signs off on those laws, the money doesn't get spent. That's checks and balances in action. The other part of our government handling the economy is something called monetary policy. And monetary policy involves money and credit and the banking system. Monetary policy is handled by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is an independent agency within the government, and they use special tools to adjust the economy. I'm going to show you some of those tools in just a moment. But just understand that fiscal policy and monetary policy are different things. Yes, you can have taxes and spending in a budget, but we also have money and credit. And we also have a banking system. All of these working together handles our economy in the United States. It isn't just taxes or it isn't just credit. Both of these work together, but they do very different things. And here's what they do. Fiscal policy and monetary policy are always on the lookout for an imbalance in our economy. When our economy goes out of balance, one of two things happens. There's either a recession or there's inflation. Recession means that the economy is in a slump. It's not doing very well. There's lots of unemployment. Prices are fluctuating and probably going down. Production across the country, we're not making as much, and we're not making as much money doing it. When there's inflation, that means the economy has overheated. It's gotten too large. And the prices have suddenly increased beyond what people can afford. Inflation will possibly lead to a collapse of the economy and then a recession. You don't want either of these. What you want is something in the middle where the economy is growing but not too fast, where there's employment but there's still jobs available for people who want something different or for people entering the market. There's production, but we're not producing too much or too quickly. Prices are stable or maybe rising slightly, but not so much that people can't afford things. Very recently, we went through a very bad recession in the United States. So you have some firsthand experience of what it's like to live through a recession. So what can the government do to fix the economy when it's gone out of hand, when it's gotten imbalanced? Well, on the fiscal side of the economy, when there's a recession, Congress and the President can decide to lower taxes, or they can decide to increase spending, or they could do both, which can be very difficult to do. But depending on what works best or what is theorized to work best, that is something that the President and Congress will negotiate and decide to do. Right now, you might have heard about people wanting lower taxes. People sometimes think that lowering their taxes will be good because they'll have more money to spend. Sometimes that can help revive the economy and get us out of a recession. Other times you'll hear people say, oh no, we need the government to increase spending. We need more money from the government put into programs and projects to keep people employed. Both of these ideas are good. It's finding the right balance between the two that is a matter of fiscal policy, and that's what the President and Congress do when there's a recession. When there's a recession, though, we also have a monetary policy to consider. The Federal Reserve, remember, is in charge of monetary policy, and they can do something to what is called the money supply. They increase it. That means they make more money available to the economy. They make more credit available to the economy. And oftentimes people don't understand how they do it, so I've put down here how they can actually do that. The Federal Reserve doesn't just magically create money. What they do is they buy government securities, or they can lower the discount rate, or they lower the reserve requirement. Sometimes they do 2 or 3 of these as a cooperative effort. Doing these things pushes more money into our economic system. It makes more money available in banks. It makes more money available in circulation. It makes more credit available for people who want to borrow money or use credit cards. Doing these things is said to increase the money supply. By increasing the money supply, you oftentimes get lower interest rates. You also get an easier time applying for a loan and getting the money you want. All of these things can help increase the spending and the purchasing power of the American people. This then makes the economy improve. Very recently, the Federal Reserve announced that they were going to buy more securities. Again, that is one example of them trying to improve the economy to keep us out of recession. What about the opposite situation, though, when there's inflation? Prices have gotten way out of hand. The economy is blowing up. There's a bubble. You might have heard that term before. Fiscal policy has some ideas for it. The government could raise taxes, or they could decrease spending, or they could do both. Fiscal policy says that when there's inflation, you need to raise the taxes so that people have less money to spend, businesses have less money to spend, and there's less pressure on the economy and less pressure on the prices to rise. That allows prices to deflate and go back to a normal rate. That allows the economy to slow down a little bit so that there's less pressure on the economy to expand or for prices to rise. That gets rid of inflation. Also, however, the government itself can decide to decrease its spending, spend less on programs and on projects. That also will cool the economy down. We get rid of a few jobs. We get rid of a few projects. With less activity going on in the economy, there's less inflation. Again, both of these are good ideas. It's just a matter of deciding what ratio you want these two to happen in. Deciding that, again, is part of fiscal policy and is what the President and Congress negotiate. If there's inflation, though, remember, monetary policy also has something to do about it. The Federal Reserve can decrease the money supply. That means they pull money and credit out of the economy as a whole. There's less money in circulation. There's less money in banks. There's less credit available to people who want to buy things. How can they do that? The Federal Reserve can sell its securities. That means that pieces of the government securities, are sold off. They can raise the discount rate. In other words, make it harder for banks to borrow money from each other and from the government. They can raise the reserve requirement, say that the bank has to keep more money in reserve in its vaults and not give it to consumers or businesses in the form of loans and money. The idea behind reducing the size of the money supply is that people will have less money to spend, meaning that they will do less shopping, less purchasing, less production in their jobs, and that inflation will be allowed to deflate. The pressure in the economy will subside, and the economy will go back to a more manageable level. Again, inflation happens, recession happens. It's the job of the government in fiscal policy and monetary policy to try and rebalance these things. Both recession and inflation can happen even when the government is doing everything possible. Because remember that our economy is just one of many economies around the world, and they're all interconnected because of globalization. What our government does, however, goes a long way in deciding how healthy and prosperous our economy is. So hopefully this has given you some information about how to do a really good job on the HSA, for the LSN portion at least. Have a good afternoon. Thanks.